I guess first to say that we haven't had a lot to cheer of late, but just to say that I'm certainly happy that the rule of law was honored in New York today. Um, it's coming in the midst of the genocide in Gaza, the escalation of the war in Ukraine. At least something seems to be going right. So I'll just say that as we begin. So my name is Joseph Gerson. I'm the president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, the co-chair of the Committee for Sane U.S. China Policy. And this evening, we're going to do something a little bit different. It's not my custom, nor that of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, for me to go it alone. Normally, we're privileged to bring other voices and perspectives from across the U.S. and internationally as we work for peace, justice, and climate sanity. Even as we're doing all that we can to stop the genocide in Gaza and the West Bank and to press for a ceasefire in Ukraine, it seemed important not to lose sight of the increasingly dangerous tensions with China. They haven't gone away. A few weeks ago, I was invited to present an introduction to U.S. Chinese relations, its tensions, and common security alternatives to a Rotary Club. I thought what I was presenting was pretty basic, most of it probably well known to my audience. But to my surprise, much of what I presented came as news to the group. From there, the idea of tweaking that presentation slightly and sharing it further occurred to me. For those of you who haven't joined us before, the campaign works for peace, disarmament, justice, and for the climate on the basis of the common security paradigm. That's the enduring truth that security cannot be achieved in competition with a nation's rival, but only with that rival. Common security served as the paradigm that led to the negotiation of the Intermediate Forces Treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union that ended the Cold War in 1987. That was 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Our work focuses on winning ceasefires in Gaza and the West Bank and the Ukraine war, with meaningful peace diplomacy to follow. We work to reduce U.S. Chinese tensions that could lead to great power, even nuclear war, and for common security diplomacy across the Asia Pacific. And just today, we tied up a loose end for a July 9th webinar to take on nuclear deterrence theory in practice with Hiroshima's former mayor, Ted Akiba, and Harvard professor Elaine Scarry. Mark your calendars. Tonight, my talk will be illustrated with a PowerPoint. I will go for about 40 minutes, and then we can turn to your questions, going into greater detail where you think it most appropriate. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen to post your questions. Please don't clutter that page up with comments that are not questions so that I can find your questions and do my best to answer them. So give me a second here while I pull up the PowerPoint, and then we will be good to go. Hang on. Okay, we'll have to do it this way. Here we go. Okay, so as we begin, I thought maybe to quote a fairly senior figure in U.S. military and Asia Pacific policymaking for the latter part of the 20th century, Joe Nye, who said that twice in the 20th century, tensions between rising and declining powers led to catastrophe, and that it's our responsibility, I put that typo there, to prevent that from happening again. U.S. national security strategy is quite clear that the post-Cold War era is over, and that the competition is on. How do we get there? That the competition is on to shape what follows. The security strategy goes on to say that Russia poses an immediate threat to the free and open international system, but that China, by contrast, is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. It's worth noting that I think it was yesterday, Xi Jinping welcomed senior leaders from across the Arab world for a summit. As the U.S. is doing what it's doing, uh, uh, making the genocide possible and alienating much of the Arab world, some of these things are falling to China. It's also, I think, worth noting that Kevin Rudd, who is former president of Australia and now the ambassador to the United States, um, sees the situation so seriously that he's basically described what we have in front of us as an avoidable war. And I just underline here a little bit to appreciate the relationship of U.S.-China relations or poor relations with the existential dangers that we face. On the one hand, as we know, we're in a situation where an accident, an incident, or a miscalculation could trigger a great power, in fact, a nuclear war. And that without U.S.-Chinese cooperation, we're not going to make the progress that we need in order to stanch and reverse the climate catastrophe. We're in a situation as well where the current circumstances, current situation has many similarities to the situation leading up to the First World War. And we need to take these seriously. We have competition between rising and declining powers. We have very complex alliance systems. We have economic interdependence and competition. We have territorial disputes. We have arms races with new technologies. And we have wild card actors, not the least of them being Donald Trump. So we need to appreciate that these are the forces that shape the world that we're in at the moment. I thought to talk a little bit about just put the current reality in a little bit of historical context. So it's pretty clear the United States, even though 250 years may seem like a long time to people, we're still a relatively young country and culture still being shaped. The United States had early trade back in the early 18th century with China. To appreciate that, or not appreciate, but to remember that the U.S. military forced open Japan and Korea back in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and that much of our current situation, our current reality, was created by an imperial war the United States fought in 1898 when we created the overseas empire. In ancient history, when I was a student at Georgetown with Bill Clinton, we had a really great professor of U.S. diplomatic history who taught that in the 1890s we had a Great Depression, and through that decade, people like Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Admiral Mahan had built the Navy that could compete with Britain. And the way forward was to try to force open or gain part of the China market, which was seen as the holy grail of capitalism. The idea was that if the U.S. could get access to the China market, it could put workers to work 24/7 in a time of workers' uprisings, forming of unions, and so on, unemployment, and at the same time, profits would escalate. So that's the foundation. That's why the Philippines was conquered, Guam, Samoa, and here in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba and Puerto Rico to gain control over the Caribbean, but more South America as a whole. So that's part of our history. Our history, no surprise these days, is rooted deeply in racism. That racism included racism against Asians, coolie labor brought here to build the railroads, and we had immigration. Immigration has been an issue for a long time, and it included exclusion of Asians to emigrate here. And to appreciate that um, at the in the early part of the 20th century, actually the first half, what we had was a series of competitions between empires for control of the Asia Pacific region. I live not very far from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. There was the Portsmouth Treaty there, which basically ended the war, the Russo-Japanese War. And part of that had to do with dividing the spoils between the United States and Japan. And while the war in Europe and against Nazism was one thing, in the Pacific theater it was something else. World War II. It was a war between competing empires, with Japanese militarists deciding that they didn't want to have to compete under the umbrella of British and U.S. Empires. So they went for the whole melon and lost at huge cost to peoples of Asia and the U.S. forces who were sent there as others as well. So you had coming at the end of the war, the Pacific being functionally an American lake. Later on, I'm going to show a visual with the first and second island chains, but to appreciate that what we have in Asia Pacific, the United States, as its empire, we have a host of alliances and literally hundreds of military bases that essentially surround China, with the exception of its north, principally Russia. So we have the U.S. kind of leading Western dominance with the G7. NATO is increasingly making ties and doing joint military exercises with U.S. allies in the Pacific. We have what's called a lattice-like network of U.S. alliances with the bases to go. The alliances include a new trilateral agreement with Japan and South Korea. We have the Quad, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. We have the new AUKUS alliance, the United States, Australia, and Britain. A new trilateral alliance, deepening alliance with Japan and the Philippines, and all of this with ongoing military exercises to be shows of force and to keep our forces prepared for a possible war. So we've got that. And let's contrast it. Let me take this down a little bit here. Let's contrast that with China, to appreciate that China is a civilization, a culture that's 5,000 years old. Some years ago, maybe almost a decade now, I was in China, hosted by ostensibly a non-governmental organization, but the man who was leading us later became a Chinese ambassador. And I asked him, I said, "What does it mean to you to be Chinese?" And he says, "It's to be an expression of 5,000 years of Chinese history." It was quite some time ago, I believe in the 1400s, that Admiral He led a fleet that went to Africa, may have gone as far as the western coast of the United States. They exercised that kind of power. Okinawa, which is now Japanese, was once upon a time a tributary state to China. China's approach to empire has been different from that of the United States. Not the kind of direct rule, but something rather more subtle. And what you hear constantly from Chinese at this point, maybe a bit more just a few years ago, was that what they've been doing since 1949 and the seizure of power of the Chinese Communist Party was overcoming 150 years of humiliation. The Opium Wars, the loss of Okinawa in 1895, the loss of major portions of northeast China to Russia, and Vladivostok was once Chinese. But you had in 1912 the Republican Revolution, and throughout the 20th century, even with its civil war, efforts to revitalize and overcome, as you can see in the comic on the right, overcoming the division of China by the colonial powers. I want us to appreciate complexity, because if we don't appreciate complexity, we're not going to see the world as it is or develop the kind of strategies we need. So the reality is that China, has more than stood up. And when I first went to China in 1999, it was a country very, very poor. Automobiles were rare. Everything and everybody moved by bicycle. And over the period, basically led by Deng Xiaoping, you've had the revitalization of China into being one of the world's two great economies at this point. And as you see with the graphic on the right, it's growing international influence economically, as well as diplomatically and otherwise. And this is where I want to go. The reality is that in many ways, the social contract is one of a golden cage. People can be prosperous as long as they haven't invested in housing at the moment. They can live full of middle-class lives. But there's a cost, especially it's gotten tighter with Xi Jinping in terms of the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of publication, so on and so forth. On the right is one of my heroes, Fang Lixi. He was a physicist, a man who had been a very loyal party member, but who was tormented, I guess you'd say, by the contradiction of the need to follow the dictated truth of the Communist Party and what he was seeing as scientific and other truth, and that led him to become really the foremost advocate of democracy, which led him to be, if you will, the inspiration for the democratic, I guess you might call it, uprising, insurgency of 1989. He ended up actually as a astrophysicist in Arizona. But to read his book, "The Most Wanted Man in China," is really an extraordinary experience. I recommend it to everyone. And just to say, the other thing I wanted to say here, I guess before I did that, was say a little bit about some of China's reasons for concern. When I was a student at Georgetown, a poor one at that, I used to babysit for the family of Kenneth Knaus. I was told before I went that his daughter was the Dalai Lama's goddaughter. And years later, I learned that Knaus had been the CIA agent responsible for arming and training the Tibetan rebels in their failed uprising of 1959. The United States has been rather deeply involved in pressing Tibetan independence. In Hiroshima in 2009, in a meeting of Nobel Peace Laureates, I had the opportunity to have a one-on-one exchange with the Dalai Lama. And I asked him if after all these years, he still thought it worthwhile to have had the armed uprising, which led to his being forced to flee Tibet. I explained that I was speaking out of my memory of work with knowledge of Kenneth Knaus. And in Hiroshima, the Dalai Lama told me, China is a totalitarian nation. It has nuclear weapons. I'm glad India has nuclear weapons. And I think serious analysts do have concerns about how much of the feudal system would return if the Dalai Lama and his political system return to Tibet. Then to look at some of the hard truths here around population, the United States has 327 million people. China has 1.4 billion. That's almost 5 times as many people as the United States. That means they can train maybe 5 times as many engineers. China, as long as it can have some degree of freedom of exploration, of thought, of science, and so on, hard to match over time. And you can see here on the right, percentages of global GDP. So the reality is that neither are going to go away. I will say that if Trump somehow gains power again in the United States, my expectation with the policies he's articulating is that the United States will be move into a period of very, very sharp decline. So something to think about. And here you have around the economies now, with Trump having initiated a process of what he hoped to be decoupling with China, and which Biden has been building on. We now have 100% tariffs on Chinese automobiles in order to save the U.S. Auto industry. So we're in an interesting period here. I guess I can use the word interesting, as the Chinese actually are the ones promoting economic globalization because they think they can grow that way. In fact, Chinese have problems with overcapacity, so they need to export. Basically, the same situation for us as in the 1890s, and the U.S. is moving finally after quite a long time toward having an industrial policy and a bit of protectionism. Okay, so let me then move to some of the flashpoints. Get the right one here. Yeah, so Taiwan is at the vortex. It's probably the most likely trigger for great power or potentially even nuclear war. And just look at the history a little bit. Initially populated by Formosans, indigenous people. Portuguese came. The Chinese did some trade, but it wasn't really controlled by China. The Portuguese were there, as you can see, 1579. The Dutch ruled it in the 1620s, and then a great naval blockade by a Chinese warlord basically led to the destruction of the Dutch rule there. You had some Chinese immigration. It was populated by a migration of Chinese, largely from just on the coast there. With the 1700s and so, and then the Japanese conquered it in 1895 and ruled it as a colony till 1945. And it's interesting. I mean, it has developed with 1949 and the defeat of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, who's a brutal dictator as well, took several million Chinese followers, along with much of China's wealth across the Taiwan Strait, and set up a dictatorship there. And the United States, was along its advocate. To appreciate, we're about 90 miles across the Taiwan Strait here. And if you're Chinese leaders, among other things, you're thinking about its potential role in terms of military attack, not unlike the United States has perceived Cuba for a very long time. It's 100 miles away. What else do we want to say here? Yeah, just to say that, with the normalization of U.S. Chinese relations, the sticking point in the negotiations, basically over a 7-year period from the time that Nixon went to China until Carter formalized and agreed to full diplomatic relations. The sticking point was whether Taiwan was part of China. And in the end, with a lot of ambiguities, the U.S. Adopted the policy insisted on by the Chinese, a one China policy, and that the U.S. would do nothing to further its independence from China. China, as I'm sure you know, has a commitment to reunifying Taiwan. It's seen as one of the last humiliations of the colonial era, and their sensible policy, their declared policy, is to have reunification by peaceful means, but that if Taiwan takes irrevocable action toward independence, at that point they would be forced to use armed force. We had the China lobby with the Republicans and many Democrats, throughout the 50s, very powerful force in Washington. And it was interesting. In the early days of the Biden administration, when we were uncertain whether or not Biden would move to a no first strike nuclear policy, as he had intimated in 2017, Dan Ellsberg predicted that the U.S. first strike policy would remain in force. And his principal reason for saying that was that the only conceivable way that the United States could ultimately defend Taiwan against the Chinese invasion was the threat of nuclear attack against China. So it's right there at the heart of the policy. What else to say here? Then just to, do I have the slide here for what's recent? Let me see. Yeah, so we just had an election, presidential election in Taiwan. The Independence Party, the DPP, which has been in power for some years now, won the election. But interestingly, the KMT, which is the old Nationalist Party, and an alliance they have of a smaller party, actually still controls the majority in the parliament. So they just passed earlier this week legislation which severely weakens the power of the DPP president, Lai, by giving them the right to call witnesses, to hold hearings in ways that they could not do before. And the United States continues to rub salt into the wounds. Here's Representative McCall, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives, with President Lai, committing the United States to support Taiwan's independence from China. And what you see on the right is a map of Taiwan. Those bars that you see, the red markings, reflect the blockade, we will call it the demonstration by the Chinese military of their effort to basically encircle and blockade Taiwan. The little kind of ovals you see closer to the Chinese coast are small Taiwanese islands, some of them just a couple of miles off of the coast of China, which in 1955 and 58 suffered artillery attacks from China, to which President Eisenhower threatened a nuclear attack on China if they didn't cease. So the tensions are high, the dangers are very real. Let me pull this down here. Turning to those tensions, the history is that the United States prepared and threatened to attack China 1955, 1958. In 1996, when China was symbolically demonstrating its ability to attack Taiwan with missiles in the run-up to a Taiwanese election, the United States sent two aircraft carriers and their supporting fleets through the Taiwan Straits. That demonstration of power panicked the Chinese leadership. And it was that that show of force that led the Chinese to invest what they have in the modernization of their military. Interesting. Secretary then Secretary of Defense Perry ordered that and oversaw that. And it's interesting. He since said that were something like that to happen again, he would still order the deployment of the U.S. Aircraft carriers and the implicit nuclear threat. Interesting to given his role in working for some degree of nuclear disarmament. So the Chinese have had a policy of minimal deterrence. Until recently, they had an arsenal of 200 nuclear weapons. They're for deterrence. Don't attack us, or we'll launch these 200. And they've now increased that number to about 500. We've seen many reports of the constructions you can see on the right of new potential missile sites. Estimates are they now have 500 nuclear weapons, and that they are maybe seeking parity with the United States and Russia with their new start limits of 1550. From what I can hear, they're doing so in phases, basically calling on the United States and Russia to agree to engage in negotiations, which would bring down the levels of U.S. and Russian missiles and to equalize it. But when they don't get the responses, they've increased it. Just to appreciate that China has long had a no first use policy, and they've been pressing the United States and the Soviet Union, or rather Russia, give away my age there, to join them in negotiations to create a no first use policy and thus reduce the nuclear threat. Okay, so then let's look a little bit at some of the flashpoints beyond Taiwan. Yeah, just to say, here's the list of nuclear threats. And yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit about the island chains. What you can see here on the left, the first and second island chain. The first island chain, which runs essentially from Japan, actually from Korea, all the way down through the Philippines and functionally over to Vietnam, is a way that the United States has been able to contain the Chinese Navy and to basically militarily reinforce U.S. hegemony in the region. And then going back, toward Guam here, you can see the second island chain. The Chinese, not being angels themselves, the Chinese government not being angels, for some time, they have made claim to what they call the 9-dash line, basically 80 or more than 80% of the South China Sea. The South China Sea has not been at the heart of U.S. peace movement consciousness, but we should understand its centrality. 40% of world trade goes through the South China Sea, including much of the Middle East oil that fuels the East Asian economies. Its seabed is thought to be extremely rich in mineral resources. Its fishing resources are incredibly valuable, and it's been obviously an area of tension. The Chinese claims overlap with those of 6 other countries, and there have been armed clashes, which we'll say a little bit about in a minute or two. The Philippines, whose Scarborough Shoal and East Thomas Shoal are either occupied or under threat. Mischief Reed is occupied. Took the case to the International Court of Arbitration based on the law of the sea, and the ruling was that China really had no legitimate claims here, but China is just maybe reflecting Mao that power grows from the barrel of a gun, and has refused to to accept that. We have now, again, in the last weeks, we've had fairly sharp confrontations as the Chinese have what are functionally naval forces that are blocking access for the resupply of a Philippine naval ship. It's pretty well allotted, but serves as a small base for Philippine troops. Then we go to the and here you can see again the surrounding China with the bases, and the Chinese, what they've done, Mischief Reef and elsewhere within the South China Sea has been to called the West Philippine Sea by the Filipinos, has been to basically dredge the seabed to create artificial islands, which in turn they've militarized and turned into bases for force projection. There have been negotiations for a South China Sea Code of Conduct. We can go more into that in Q&A if you're interested. But clearly the way forward is to come up with a code of conduct that allows for the free movement of trade and commerce in the area. I guess international waters, military has a right to be there, but not in confrontational mode. And you can see here from a Philippine television, actually, a reflection of the kind of confrontation between a Chinese and Philippine ship. Then even less high on peace movement consciousness are the Senkaku Dayo Islands in the East China Sea. You can see on the left that these are uninhabited islands. And on the right, you see that Chinese, Taiwanese, and Japanese naval ships have been contesting control in the region. It's one of the areas where an incident could happen all too easily and spark escalation. The U.S. Japan treaty, mutual assistance treaty, Article 5 requires the United States to come to Japan's aid in the case of it's attacked. Oops, you didn't want to see that move. And the reality is that at the end of the Second World War, China did not participate in peace negotiations. The United States assigned administration of these islands to Japan. When Japan and China normalized relations in the 1970s, they agreed to put the question of sovereignty over these islands on the diplomatic shelf, not to address it. But a right-wing mayor of Tokyo actually in the 1980s, no, oh, I'm sorry, the late 1990s, put it back on the basically moved to buy it, and it created a crisis. So now you have constant Japanese and Chinese planes and aircraft demonstrating their ability to control it, with the possibility that it could get much worse. Then, drawing toward the end here, and thank you for your patience, we have a number of kind of recent events that I just want to draw your attention to. We have the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which is basically the driving force of hawks in Congress and in Washington for confrontation with China. Some of them believe that war with China is inevitable and that we should maybe do the war while we have strategic advantage. At the same time, tensions between Biden and Xi, the Biden administration and the Chinese, has been quite intense. But about 6 months ago or so, actually beginning before the balloon incident, we had movement toward something like, if not detente, at least a coexistence and an effort to reduce the increasingly dangerous tensions. So you have now resumption of military to military meetings and diplomacy. You've had a number of cabinet members go to China to meet with um, uh, their peers on the other side, but we're a long way to go. So then to say there are alternatives, there are ways to more peaceful relations. Uh, I'm working with people across the Asia Pacific now in developing a common security resource that we expect to be publishing in the fall. But basically, these are a number of the points where I think we'll be making recommendations. Um, so reinforcing the current détente. Um, in relationship to Taiwan, uh, even Biden has been undermining the one China policy. The former Chinese line of one nation, two systems, which was supposed to allow Hong Kong to retain much of its democratic culture and freedoms. That's now there's just no credibility uh, for that in Taiwan. And so it's clear that we need to be developing a new paradigm that can allow for the continuation of Taiwanese democratic culture, but also hewing to a one China policy. We need to be halting the arms races, moving toward no first use diplomacy, and most central, I would say, and the Chinese have been asking for this for some time, negotiations to eliminate the danger of cyber hacking of nuclear command and control systems, which essentially would disarm the rival. Um, uh, to reduce military exercises, deepen the military and economic stability dialogue, moving ahead with a South China Sea code of conduct, and uh, among others, here in the United States, well, for both, increasing student and cultural exchanges. They still have many Chinese students and scholars here in the United States, very few Americans going to China. We can't understand what's going on. It really hurts relations. I think the Fulbright fellowships have been canceled and need to be renewed. And then finally, we've got to quit the racial profiling of Asians and Asian Americans, not to mention others as well. So that concludes it. I'm 5 minutes over time, and I'm glad to now move to your questions. I see we've got two in there, and please be patient with me as we go forward here. Do I think the U.S. will still support Taiwan once we catch up with them in the production of chips for computers and phones? My friend in Taiwan expressed that concern. Um, I think one thing to say is that there's no such thing as a permanent alliance. Not that we have a formal alliance, but certainly a functional one with Taiwan. Um, there's just too many uncertainties to be able to answer that with any sense of accuracy or over too much time, right? I mean, on the one hand, there's the irony as we've got Taiwanese chip investment in places like Arizona where they're running out of water. Brilliant investments there. It's going to be some time before the United States is able to produce its highest quality semiconductor chips that our economy needs. And there are other strategic concerns involved. I mean, take a look at that 80-mile distance across the Taiwan Strait. But who knows who's going to be president next January? Who knows what's going to be happening in 10 years? It's unclear. Where does Hong Kong fit into the picture? Well, as I said a little bit ago, the one country, two systems paradigm has failed, right? For some period of time, the reversion agreement was respected by Beijing, but in the last couple of years, among other things, with the movement of Chinese military forces into into Hong Kong with its appointment of new mayors and administration, its basic repression of the democratic freedoms that Hong Kong long hadn't enjoyed. That's over, and what you can see uh, uh, in Hong Kong, as in parts of China, under Xi Jinping, there's less respect for um, uh, private industry, private capital. Uh, some leaders of companies have been jailed, arrested, harassed, and so what we see is a decrease in Western, and not only Western but Japanese and other countries' investment in Hong Kong. So I think the sense is that while Hong Kong has the kind of foundations that it has economically, its role both in relationship to China and in relationship to international commerce and capitalism is going to decline. You can see that I think they've just outlawed the singing of one of the songs of the Hong Kong democracy movement that reflects it. David Hartso, is the U.S. government really willing to risk nuclear war with China, given that it could end up with most people in the U.S. and China dead? Why isn't there more focus made on finding alternatives to military confrontation? Um, I'm thinking here, David. There was a webinar um, in the last couple of weeks. I think it was maybe the Stimson Center, and one of the former most senior figures uh, with responsibility for the U.S. strategic arsenal was asked if Russia used tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, would the United States respond with nuclear weapons? And this woman's response was yes. That's how deterrence works. And unfortunately, unfortunately, it doesn't begin to say it. Uh, we for ever since the Russians developed their nuclear weapons, uh, deterrence theory has become basically the ultimate religious belief among the United States and to a degree other nuclear powers. So our military is trained. Some people will have read or just seen the webinar with Annie Jacobson, her book Nuclear War Scenario. Uh, I think her idea for what would be the trigger for escalation into nuclear war was not the best she could have chosen, but nonetheless, she describes in absolutely chilling detail how once the triggers are pulled, the system works to escalate to function on up to the end of human life. In her case, she does it in 72 minutes. We end humanity. One thing also worth saying, David. I was in a meeting a couple weeks ago. I can't say too much about it, but it included a former um, uh, senior Russian military official, and many people on this call will be aware that back when Colonel Petrov of the Soviet military, who was responsible for conveying the unhappy information that the Soviet Union was under nuclear attack based on what he could see on his computer screens. He read that a false warning was coming through, and he went to notify the senior leaders that was there, and we thought that was all there was to it. That somehow he blocked it. What this former Soviet military official said was that the computer signal went all the way through to the Russian nuclear suitcase, which is to say their version of our president's nuclear football. So dire was that Andropov, the leader of the Soviet Union, was awakened. Petrov's word did come through and played a major role in preventing the automatic systems going into place. But unfortunately and tragically, criminally, the world is wired, and we live on this edge in which a miscalculation, let alone an incident, say overzealous U.S. naval or Chinese naval figure launching a torpedo against the other side could trigger the end of life as we know it. We have a military-industrial complex, as I said before, we have the first strike doctrine, in part because of the commitment to maintain Taiwan's functional independence. So it's, the situation is serious. We need to be talking about it, and we need to be more than talking about it. We need to be finding ways to get out there to raise the alarm and change the policy. Put my glasses back on here from Peter Burgell. Some years ago, there was some interest in Taiwanese government circles to develop civilian-based defense instead of relying on military defense. Is any of that interest remaining? I'm sure that some of it is remaining. One of the reasons that the Chinese have not moved to seize, even by means of blockade, Taiwan, is they recognize that there are huge costs to it. On the one hand, the response in terms of moving to isolate China would make the response to Tiananmen Square probably look small. And on the other hand, the chaos and disorder, the need to move to militarily occupy a resisting population is more than the Chinese leaders need right now, or probably anytime soon. So it's there. There are forces committed to nonviolence, but to Taiwanese independence that we've had some contact and work with over the years. So that's what I have for questions here. If there are any more, please put them in. If not, I'm going to thank everybody and let me thank Mariana Fernandez, who is invisible here, but she has been at the controls and making all of this possible. I look forward to being in contact with you. And actually, I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to put into the chat the name of the link for Sane U.S. Sane. I can type would help. Yeah, this is a small project that Michael Clare and I, there we go, have been working with for some time. Their webpage has got a tremendous amount of material, analysis, history, and so on. And I'd encourage you to go take a look at that. Thank you all who've joined us. I hope you found it somewhat helpful. I look forward to pushback from some of you, and work for peace, work for justice, work to protect the climate, and take a look at what common security is about. It's really what we need to be working for. Thank you.